Welcome to the Landlord Profitability Playbook Podcast, where we share the best practices we use to help our residential real estate investor clients automate their rent collection and get on with their lives. Check out the show notes at www.landlordprofitabilityplaybookpodcast.com. This show is brought to you by Roost Real Estate Co. Property Management. To learn more about our company and the services we provide, visit www.managewithroost.com. Now, here's your host, Chris McAllister.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Landlord Profitability Playbook Podcast. I'm Chris McAllister, and I'm here to help you create and coach business opportunities and strategies that support and add value to the lives of residential real estate investors. Joining me today are my trusted co-hosts, Lacey LeBlanc and Gretchen Mitchell. Good morning, ladies.
Morning.
Good morning.
Today, we're diving into part 4 of our series called What to Expect from Your Property Manager. And today's episode is titled, Can They Control Rehab and Maintenance Costs? Rehab and regular maintenance are the two things that absolutely make or break landlord profitability. You know, we've been doing this for quite a few years, and everything, it seems, comes back to having to fix things or having to get things cleaned up between tenants. And it's the thing that just crushes the hopes and dreams of our owners, and it doesn't do much for our team either. So before we get started, I wanted to just talk about something that I came across the other day. I try to listen to a lot of podcasts and read a lot of blogs about different property management companies, what they put out there. And this actually came from Property Meld. And Property Meld is the vendor that we use to schedule and track maintenance needs in occupied units. And one of the folks that works at Meld had a post out last week. I think it might have been on LinkedIn, but it's stats about the cost of a Meld 5 years ago versus the cost of a Meld today.
Wait, so for those of us who don't property manage all day, every day, what is a Meld? Define a Meld for me, please.
Well, Gretchen, you go ahead. Tell us what a Meld is.
So a meld is the same as a work order. So it's a request from a tenant or an owner to get something repaired. But Property Meld uses the word meld. So that's where he's using the word meld.
Yeah. As a marketer, I really appreciate that. Good for them.
Yeah. But here's the thing. In 2018, the average cost of a work order or a Meld, as Property Meld phrases it, was $272.87. That's how much it costs on average for a property management company to send somebody out and fix something in a rental unit. That price went up in 2019 to about $312 per Meld. 2020 was $340 per Meld. In 2021, that cost went to $377. 2022 was $442. It was $407. And in 2024, thus far this year, the average cost of a work order across all of the properties and all of the owners and all of the tenants that Property Meld services is $501 for the average cost of a Meld. That's, it's not quite doubled, but my goodness, it's getting there. And I know our owners are feeling it. And we're feeling it too, because, if I'm just going to be absolutely honest, we have raised our prices on repairs and maintenance, but we certainly haven't kept up with this trend, and we're doing our best to keep those costs down. And it's something that you definitely want to have a conversation about with any property management company that either you're currently working with or you're considering working with. But $501 per Meld, how does that strike you, Gretchen? Is that surprising, or does that feel right?
I actually really love this information because I'm going to start using this when I have initial conversations with people, because like you said, maintenance and turns is what really sucks up an owner's money. So if they know this going in and understand it, it's going to be very helpful. But it does make sense. Things have gone up so much, and we do hear it from owners. A lot of times there's a lot of pushback on, why does this turn cost so much? Well, this is truly just the quote that we got. And so sharing this with them is going to be really helpful.
Yeah. And turns have gone up just as dramatically as just basic, maintenance in occupied units. I mean, so it is scary. So one of the things that I thought we should talk about today was what can your property management company do upstream? What can they do proactively to try to control maintenance and repair costs down the road? I think one of the easiest things that we've talked about before in prior podcasts is it really does come down to doing a great job screening and selecting tenants. We've talked about before that yes, we want to, quote, we want to screen in. We screen in, we don't screen out. But, part of our goal is to screen in tenants that, of course, will pay the rent on time, but we also look to see what kind of history they have in terms of how they took care of the property or how they left the property when they moved out. And that's why it's critical that your property management company doesn't just stop at a credit report or a paid for background check, that they take the time and trouble to at least try to contact prior landlords and get a feel for whether or not they took care of the property. We try very hard to instill in people that yes, we expect you to pay the rent. Yes, we expect you to abide by the terms of the lease. And yes, we expect you to leave the property at the end of that lease in as good or better condition than when you took it on. So I do think it's a little fuzzy, it's a little feel good, but I do think it matters that we set expectations up front with everybody we rent to.
And when they move in, we make sure they understand this is how you meld in a work order request. Make sure they're very comfortable with using that portal.
Yeah, I think that's critical too, that they know how to get help. But I also think it's absolutely critical that we just make sure that they understand our expectations. And then there's other things that happen. And I'm guilty of this too as a landlord. There are things that landlords can do from a preventive maintenance standpoint that we just don't really want to pay for, right? Whether it's as simple as cleaning out the gutters every year so that the rain doesn't pool along the foundation and leak into the basement, or changing the furnace filters. You can try to leave that the responsibility of the tenants, but it doesn't really, it doesn't work all that often. But preventive maintenance is also critical, and that's one of the things that I'd like to see our rehab and maintenance team get better at, is identifying those places where a little preventive maintenance will go a long way, and making those services available to our owners. And again, if we can do it at a reasonable cost to competitive cost, better than competitive cost, then we want to provide that service to our owners.
I think this is a very interesting conversation, given kind of the way society is moving and the shelter business that you guys are in. Because now, if you look at kind of the statistics, if you pay any attention to the news, you can see that us millennials are not all interested in owning a home ever. Right? Some of us, I do own my home, but some of us are not interested in ever owning a home. We like the concept of renting. We like the concept of, one of the main keys of that is we don't have to do all of the maintenance, right? We don't have to have $10,000 in the bank in case we need something big, right? In case our HVAC goes out, or we need a new roof, or a sump pump installed. So I think that striking that balance between landlord, responsibility and tenant responsibility, and being really clear on that from the get-go, just like, Gretchen said, and you said, kind of making sure that tenants know what their responsibilities are, and you guys, follow through and know what your responsibilities are. I think that's a really interesting concept. And I don't think that it's something coming from a family of, property owners, landlords. I don't think that it's something that most property management teams or landlords do that well. So I think it's interesting that you guys are having that conversation and really kind of clarifying that for people. I think that's going to go a long way, especially as, the generation up and coming that would have been buying homes now are deciding that they would like to rent long term.
Yeah, and I don't think that it's necessarily everybody's aware that yes, interest rates are driving up rents because it costs more to, borrow money. Pop taxes continue to go up based on the value of the homes, increasing. Insurance has gone through the roof, but it's also the rehab and maintenance costs that are driving rent. And you can't have, a meld or work order, almost double in value and not see that at some point, play into the amount of rent that has to be charged, basically all the way across the rental market. So when you think about how do you set the stage to make your tenant a partner? And some of this, I just want to make sure we discuss. Some of it's pet peeves, some of it, again, I think it just bears getting out in the open and having an open discussion with your property manager. And it's something that we, need to be discussing with our owners. So first of all, when we talk about setting expectations, we do have a really nice little brochure that we share with all of our potential tenants. It's called Rent with Roost. And again, it outlines exactly what they can expect from us, and it outlines what we expect from them. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But a couple of things that I feel like get in the way of setting the right expectation up front with a potential tenant is, and Gretchen, I know we're kind of dealing with this now, but it's very hard to have a rental property on the market and available for lease when the current tenant is still in there. Right. It's different than if a homeowner wants to sell their home and they're showing their home, they're going to put something in their pockets. But, a tenant basically has no obligation whatsoever to show their property. Tenants' rights dictate that they don't have to let anybody in that property while they're in the lease. So I think one of the mistakes that landlords make is trying to, show a property while the current tenant is still in there in hopes of getting a new tenant in there. Part of it is, there's the aggravation factor and the annoyance factor, and the tenant is definitely going to be putting out the vibe that they're being put out. The other thing is, who's to say that the current tenant, if they feel put out, is going to, have the house neat and tidy and, is going to be allowing it to show in its best light. So that's something to be aware of. A lot of us want to mitigate any downtime. We don't want to lose a month's rent. So, it does happen. And, I'm sure there's some situations where it works, but it's just something to keep in mind. And I think it's something to discuss with your property manager, potential property manager, if it's something that you feel strongly about as an owner.
The other thing too with the frustration is we can go in and show it to a potential tenant, but we don't have a set move-in date because things look totally different when a resident moves their items out. We don't know what's behind the couch. We don't know about any underlying issues that maybe they hadn't shared. So you get a lot of activity as soon as you put the sign in the yard. And then for it to be delayed, well, I don't actually know when you're going to move in. It kind of defeats the purpose of everyone getting excited about a brand new listing out there.
The best case is that, the property management company is able to, get control of the house the day the previous tenant moves out, the locks get changed, the, inspection is done. They get a feel, within 24 to 48 hours, exactly what it's going to take and what it's going to cost to get that back in service. There's a conversation that's held with the owner. Owner says, yes, things get done. And, best case, you're only going to be out maybe a month's rent, maybe two on average. But bear in mind, the national average, nobody ever has 100% occupancy or 0% vacancy. And, 1 month out of the year is roughly a 10% vacancy. But if the average tenant stays in a property for 3 years, you have to factor in that every 3 years, there's going to be not just some costs for rehab, but there's also going to be some vacancies. So, to have 2 months rent, 2 months vacant every, 3 years, that math isn't as horrible as it feels in the moment, so it's about being realistic about the cost, being realistic about what it means to be a landlord, being realistic about, what vacancies really are and looking like and planning for them. The other thing
benefits of that, like that right tenant, right, outweigh those 2 months worth
oh
of
my
rent by far,
gosh,
right? My family just said
absolutely.
goodbye to a tenant who was there for almost 30 years. Like, we did the math and he could have paid for that house 3 times, like bought it 3 times, and he left it better than he found it. He did a bunch of upgrades. It was always clean. The yard was beautiful. It just, the value of having that right person in there. When you think about, oh gosh, if I had just spent an extra month, right, getting things ready and making sure that the right person got in there, and then you had a 30-year tenant, like how great would that be? So I think that like with most things, right? You do the work and put in the work and the reward comes with it. But I just think that people, they get super worried about, oh, it's another month. I know Nana, we talk about Nana a lot, but Nana just hates to see it go one more month without a renter in it. And so she gets kind of blinded by, if you just spent one more month doing a few extra things, then you might get the right person in there for a long time. And really, this whole thing's about profitability, right?
Absolutely. And every time you have a vacancy, it just eats into your profitability, no question about it. But I'd rather plan for a vacancy that, I miss 2 months every 3 years as my worst case than, take shortcuts and try to save some money today and never have a tenant finish out the lease or not take care of the property. The other thing that's, a little bit aggravating, we have a lot of owners that do their own turns, right? They, either they do it themselves or they have their own people that go in and get properties ready between tenants. And sometimes, most of the time it works out great. Their standards are our standards. It's wonderful. Other times we have to go in, especially if it's an out-of-state owner, and then we've got to do our inspection and we find that, any number of things still aren't quite right. Either it's not clean or the refrigerator doesn't work or the screens aren't in. Whatever it is, every owner, every management company should have a checklist of how things have to be before not just a tenant moves in, but before it's shown. And that goes back to our minimum standards document where, we have a document that says this is what we expect from our owners. These are the standards that we require for our properties, the absolute minimum. We'll put that in the show notes too. And when we get pushback from an owner that wants us to show a property that is, for lack of a better term, a shoddy refresh, we risk advertising a property that's not rent ready or is poorly presented. You're going to attract people who, are, I don't want to say desperate, but if you've got two properties and they're both $1,000 a month and one is a shoddy refresh and one is, to standard and ready for, potentially Section 8 or what have you, obviously the one that's in great shape for the same price or better shape for the same price is going to go faster. And the one that ends up with the shoddy refresh is probably going to be, a candidate that maybe isn't your first choice to screen in, right? And I think the message there is, and then again, this gets a little bit fuzzy and it's all philosophical, I guess, but if they don't think that we as the property management company don't care what a property looks like when we show it, or if an owner doesn't care what the property looks like when they show it, I can tell you flat out, they won't care either. And I think we've seen that happen over and over. The other thing, again, I think that gets people in trouble, of course, is, people get scared, they get desperate, and a couple of things happen that, sort of cost rehab and maintenance money and aggravation downstream. But charging too much for the property, if your rent is above, what the market rate is, you're going to attract people who are desperate to get a roof over their heads and may only have the first month's rent and the deposit. And the other thing that happens is if the property is not ready and you still have to get X, then it's when people tend to start relaxing their screening criteria. And all of those things may ease a little bit of pain once in a while, today, but almost all of those things come back and cost you time, money, and aggravation, maybe even before the end of the lease that they signed. So this is just gloom and doom today, isn't it? I don't mean it to be, but again,
I keep trying to bring you guys to the light over here, but you just don't take the bait. 30-year tenant.
And I want our listeners to when they're interviewing a property
Often.
management company or having a conversation with their management company, I want them to ask these hard questions. How do you make sure that before you advertise a property, it's in good shape, right? What are your screening criteria? What expectations do you have for your tenant when it comes to rehab and maintenance? What is a tenant going to get charged for versus what an owner is going to be charged for, right? If an owner, backs up the toilet with a load of Legos, they're going to get charged for that, right? And rightly so. So if they break the window, they're going to get charged. There's other things that happen that, it's absolutely appropriate that the owner pay. But knowing what those standards are, being clear on them, having been through it before, that's something that you want to be looking for. And all of this, I think, comes back to the whole idea of, does that property manager understand the concept of the neighborhood standard, right? We've had, a couple of podcasts about the neighborhood standard, and that simply means that does the property, is it at or above potentially, but is it at the standard of the neighborhood? And again, it goes back to, we don't want to see owners over improve properties above and beyond what's the standard for the neighborhood, but we certainly don't want them to ignore properties to the point where they fall behind the standard of the neighborhood. And that comes back to, rent. If the standard in that neighborhood is X, and for whatever reason the owner needs, X plus Y, that is generally, that's hard. It may not happen. By the same token, it's a little bit better if the standard is X and your property's not quite there. So you're reducing the rent a little bit. There is a place for that. That's for sure. You still have to do some screening. You still have to have some conversations. You still have to, to do your homework with those potential applicants. But everything comes down to that whole idea of the neighborhood standard. You don't over improve because you're not going to get the rent back, and you can't under maintain a property because either it's going to hit you by making it harder to rent, and if it doesn't hit you there, it's going to hit you at the end of the lease. So I wanted to talk about questions to ask in this interview process about what their rehab and maintenance department looks like. And it's really hard I know it's hard for me, I'm sure, Gretchen, to talk about this without using, our own company as an example. So Gretchen, why don't you tell us, when do we use a W-2 employee versus, hiring an outside 1099 contractor?
So when it comes to the routine maintenance, as soon as we get a meld or a work order, we'll send our maintenance crew out to try to take care of the situation. And if they arrive and they find that it's, a main drain backup, that's not something we have the equipment for. So then we'll send out a 1099 contractor or a plumbing company to take care of something like that. Normally we try to take care of it in-house because we know the guy's schedule, so we can actually tell them when it's going to happen and tell the owners when it's going to happen instead of relying on a 1099 or outside contractor or company. Same with the turns. A lot of times, we're waiting on a contractor to say, yeah, you're on the schedule for this day. But if we can use our W-2 employees, we know exactly when they're going to be there, and we control that schedule to stay on time, stay on track.
Yeah, and we use W-2 employees in occupied units almost exclusively, unless, like you said, there's something that is beyond, their capability. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One, they're employees, so they are expected to go where we want them to go when we tell them to go. So, there's some control and some, not just on our part, but there's some control on the tenant's part when they have a better idea of when they can expect somebody. It's also better for, liability coverage. It's better for, the owners, the tenants, and for our insurance situation as well. The other thing that I think is worth asking is work trucks versus mileage reimbursement for the 1099 employees. So we've gone round and round about this. We went years and years without ever providing any trucks. And then in Columbus, about 3 years ago, we decided that we needed to have some work trucks in the fleet, so to speak, because we were having a harder and harder time hiring qualified people, maintenance people, to work for us. And part of it was, yes, we pay mileage, at the government rate, but there's still, even though that's of course above and beyond whatever their hourly wage is, but there's still a management function that has to happen with that employee, with that the two person, in that they have to make sure that money actually gets set aside to make their truck payment, to fix their truck, to keep gas in it, and so forth. So we're fortunate right now that we've got 3 trucks, 3 great guys, with great driving histories and so forth, that drive those trucks. It's also great marketing, and it also makes the tenants feel better when somebody rolls up and they see it's a Roost truck. But lately, thank goodness, we've got the other 4 guys. I think we're up to 7 folks now, right? 7 maintenance people now, is that right?
Yeah.
So we've got 4 of our guys that are providing their own transportation, and so we pay them mileage as well as trip time, and that all gets built into the cost. And that's also one of the reasons why the average cost of a meld has gone up so much in the last 5 years. So it's important to ask, your property manager, how do you handle rehab and maintenance? Do you have employees? Are you farming everything out? Do your costs include, all these other things? And at the end of the day, are those costs reasonable?
One place to look, and I've noticed this since you guys started doing Google reviews, is how, like, people will absolutely go and talk about a bad experience, right? On a Google review. They'll vent to anybody who will listen. But I see every day reviews come through for your maintenance team specifically about how timely they were, about how knowledgeable they were, about how well they did, about how well they communicated. If the problem couldn't be fixed that day, then they communicated what the follow-up plan would be and when someone else would be there. Because I think that when you get outside of those W-2 employees and you have to rely on an outside source, be it a 1099 or an extra another company, then like you said, you're not in control of that timeline. You're on their timeline. So communication with the tenant about what that's going to look like can really kind of ease some anxiety and prevent some bad reviews, I think. And it seems like your team does a really great job of doing that. And I think that again attests to the fact that you guys have these expectations set, that you communicate them with your W-2 employees, and that you have the processes in place, which, if Nana could get just one maintenance person, bless her heart, that's her number one struggle, is she can't find anybody to do the work consistently and in a timely fashion, but she's relying completely on outside contractors and people who own their own businesses. So I think you've kind of nailed something there with these W-2 employees.
Well, and there's a handful of things that have gone into getting us to this point where maintenance is a plus for the company, right? I mean, and the Google reviews, taking an interest, getting everybody involved, hiring people who understand the importance of doing that kind of excellent work, and asking for the review. That's all absolutely critical. But we used to, back in 2017, 2018, I think the highest paid maintenance person we had, I don't know if we were hitting $25 an hour, and we certainly didn't provide trucks back then. I think it was closer to probably 18 to 22, maybe 20 was the average. And we've got maintenance guys today that are making $35 an hour. And it took me a long time to get comfortable with that. But because we've gotten very good at hiring and screening for employees, like we've gotten good at hiring and screening for tenants, these guys are first class. I'd stack them up against any group of maintenance people, in all of Ohio, quite frankly. But there is a cost to that. And to pay less and get a lesser employee, it just absolutely isn't worth it. So, that's part of what's driving up the cost of a meld. But the other things that have made a huge difference in those reviews is the fact that the Property Meld itself, this software that we use that interfaces with Appfolio, it's a great communication tool. It's a great scheduling tool. The owners can see the melds that come in, the work orders that come in. They can control how much they see, when they see it. It helps control costs. It definitely controls the schedule. So that's the second thing that's made a massive difference. And the third thing that's made a massive difference, excuse me, are Heather and Jade. Heather's our rehab and maintenance manager, whatever you want to call her, goddess. And she's in charge of all things rehab and maintenance. And she's responsible for the turns and wrangling 1099 contractors on turns. And Jade, she basically is the conductor for Meld, right? So she manages all the work orders that come in via Property Meld. She dispatches them. She's got a fantastic relationship with those seven guys, and between getting the right guys and just sucking it up and paying what the market requires, getting the right software in place. And this software isn't cheap. We're sitting at about roughly 1,000 units, and Property Meld costs us about $2,500 a month every single month, but it's indispensable. We can't take care of our owners or our tenants without it. And then getting some great leadership in place to help Gretchen. Those are the things that have really helped us turn the corner on those Google reviews. The other thing I think about too, managing costs, we have one gentleman, Paul Dixon, who is just one of those unicorns that is an expert at HVAC, is an expert at electricity, he's an expert at plumbing. He's just terrific. And, he's been working with us for, gosh, Gretchen, what, at least 3-4 years now, maybe?
Oh, at least, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
probably 4 or 5, yeah.
Yeah, and he's an outside contractor. He's a 1099 guy, but he knows that he can count on us for a steady stream of work. He knows he can count on us to get him paid, quickly. And again, this whole business always comes back to relationships, but having that kind of 1099 contractor relationship where Gretchen and Heather, basically treat him as if he was an internal employee, that makes all the difference in the world. And you've had great history, like I think, is it Rick Lucas and
Yeah, Rick and
yeah.
Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, so they've been doing turns, for owners on our behalf for a long time. So again, what works for us is we want to do the maintenance and occupied units with W-2 contractors, and we do the majority of our between tenant turns with outside contractors. But we're also working on building up our own turn team to do some of the less involved turns that just require, paint and cleanup, because we can get it done quicker at this point and more cost effectively. The other thing that is making a huge difference is, we used to run through maintenance guys like crazy. We just couldn't keep them. And now, you've got Don and Paul out there that, my gosh, I mean, they've been with you for what, 2, 3 years now?
Oh, I think 5.
Yeah, I mean, those two guys alone have been with us for a long time, and you get that sort of institutional wisdom, you get that experience, and they know how to, talk to and work with the tenants. And but then they also understand too that, this is a situation where, yes, we're writing them a check from Roost, but their time and work is getting reimbursed by the owner. So it takes a special person to excel at that. And it's definitely something that you want to find out, how your property management company or your property manager feels they're doing in that whole rehab and maintenance department. I feel like I'm going on and on about this, but we've been through the ringer and back again. So the other thing to ask.
I just think you're hitting on so many pain points. And this is so valuable, I think, for people, for people with a lot of properties. I think they've had to kind of institutionalize a little bit, right? Even
Yeah.
if they're doing it themselves, they have to put some processes in place. How else would they manage? But there are people out there who are trying to decide constantly, probably have been for 10 years or as long as they've owned a property, should I work with a property manager, or should I do it myself, right? And again, I think you're just pointing out all of the complexities of this and kind of making clear how the investment that you can make in a property manager pays off, especially if you want to, automate your rent collection and get on with your life. I don't know where I heard that killer phrase, but I just think that it makes it really clear when you sit down and you have the discussion all at one time, or in this case in 12 parts, all at one time in 12 parts. It really like lays it out there, because if you're deep in it day to day, managing your own properties or dealing with a property management company who's not doing a good job, then this really makes it clear how having a property management team to work with that does do a good job could just be a game changer,
Oh, it
a
makes all the
life changer
difference
for
in the world.
folks.
Yeah. The other thing to ask about are there plans and processes for handling after-hour emergencies? We have a 24-hour answering service where if a house, I don't know, pipes freeze or something catches fire, God forbid, in the middle of the night, what is their procedure to get outside of Property Meld and, get help to these tenants? So ask them about that as well. I believe we still have the guys rotate between holding the phone, so to speak, on nights and weekends. And that's, overall has worked out pretty well. And thankfully, we haven't had a whole lot of after hours emergency lately. But it's a great question to ask your property manager or potential property manager. The other thing that comes up a lot is, what is your property manager's policy on expecting owners to maintain reserves for maintenance and rehab costs? Some of our larger owners, they may take a draw, but they leave a substantial amount of money in the trust account so to cover things that just happen, right? And our property management agreement says that we can spend up to $600 in the event of an emergency without, you know, getting permission. But if you've got somebody, with 100 properties or 50 properties, they could have far more emergencies than somebody else. So what is their policy for asking you for maintaining reserves to cover maintenance and rehab costs? And how do they feel about the whole idea of, financial stewardship? I will tell you that, we are pretty clear about what we charge owners for reimbursing W-2 payroll. And, I have to say it's not enough based on everything that goes in there, whether it's insurance or trucks or workers' comp or vacations, holidays, and so forth. But there also has to be enough slush in there for stupid mistakes. And as good as our guys are, there are still times when things happen that we just flat out in good conscience cannot and will not pass along to the owner. So I think the phrase that we use is suppressing. Sometimes we end up suppressing those charges or just flat out reimbursing those charges if they happen to get past us in Appfolio, because the last thing we don't want our tenants to suffer, because if tenants suffer, owners suffer, right? But we certainly don't want our owners to suffer because we did something stupid, or not stupid. I mean, our guys aren't intentionally do anything stupid, but sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes you go out to a property, it doesn't get fixed the first time. Maybe we wait too long before we hire an HVAC contractor to come out. In any case, what is their position on, quote, financial stewardship? How are they taking care of you? And again, what is their software platform? If they're more of a boutique shop, how do they handle the orders? How do they handle the money and so forth? And then the other thing that comes up is, our owners get paid out. Usually 90% of our owners get all of their money by the 10th or 11th of the month, every single month, which means that there's less money available in case of emergency for the remainder of the month till the rent comes back faster. So there are times, if something happens, say it's more than $1,000, or it's definitely more than what next month's rent's going to be, that we do have to go to the owner and say, hey, look, this happened. This is what it's going to cost. We're going to need you to go to your portal, get out your credit card, and upload some funds so we can get this taken care of on your behalf. Just like on a turn, we have to have our owners, if there's a turn that costs $5,000, then, they're going to have to upload funds to take care of that. Now, on the other hand, when we have some owners that have, quite a few properties, and especially if we've, been working with them for a long time and something comes up, we will, quote, front money on behalf of that owner, from our pocket, but we know that it's okay, because when the rent comes in next month, there's going to be more than enough to get us paid back, so to speak. So in that respect, we are, generally, I don't want to say happy, but we are capable and fortunate to be able to, help an owner out without having to aggravate them by, asking them for cash, after they get paid out. We can generally absorb a whole bunch of that and get ourselves reimbursed when the rent comes in next month before the first check run. So again, and maybe that's not as big a deal if you just have one property, but if you have more than one property, the ability and the willingness of your property manager to partner with you like that, I think is pretty valuable. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
I'm droning on and on. I'm putting Gretchen to sleep. All right. So a little bit about our history. There was a time when I didn't want to do any rehabs. I thought it was above and beyond what we were capable of doing. I didn't want to be a construction management company. And, we sort of shut that down a few years ago. And now it's a point of differentiation for us. And now, like you said, it's at the point where, we've got this built to where we're actually getting 5-star reviews for our maintenance guys. And, we've come a long way. So that may be a too perfect world for some of the folks that you're talking to about managing your properties, but it's still worth asking the questions and getting those thoughts and expectations out there. And we talked about how we're structured and how lucky we are to have Heather, Jade, and then now Paul out there taking pictures and doing that Site Audit Pro app to help Heather figure out what kind of bids she needs to get and then get the okay from the owner to get those rehabs done. So that's kind of where we are. I think that sort of gives everybody some talking points for what to expect from your property manager and, questions to ask if you're interviewing a property manager. But I think it all comes down to the ability of a property management company to effectively control rehab and maintenance. It's just the cornerstone of keeping a successful investment. You still got to keep in mind the neighborhood standard. You've got to make sure that they have a maintenance department, or if it's outsourced, that they have a system in place to take care of the tenants and take care of you, the owner. How do they treat their folks? Do they provide trucks? How do they make sure that their maintenance guys can actually get to a problem when a problem arises? How do they handle your money? What kind of tools do they use? I think these are all things that that you at least want to bring up or at least investigate as you move forward. So I guess this is something that we haven't done before, Gretchen and Lacey, but before we wrap, I do want to invite any of our listeners that happen to be in our market areas, basically anywhere from Columbus to Springfield and, on the Space Coast of Florida, please check us out. I am super duper proud of where we've come from, especially with the rehab and maintenance team and the whole team all together. And we are ready to start expanding the number of owners that we work with. And, we have the capacity now to bring on some more great owners and bring on some more doors. So please never feel that if you're listening to this, that we don't want to talk to you as well. And feel free to ask us these questions. We'll answer just like we did today. So if you'd like to get a free quote for property management or a quick consultation with Gretchen, you can check out our website at Invest with Roost, or you can literally go to a website we have called pmservicesquote.com, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. So this is the hardest sell I guess I've ever made at the end of a podcast, Lacey. Hopefully you'll forgive me, but I'm
really proud of you.
And I think it's time we kind of get it out there. So the next time when we get together for part 5, the title of our next episode coming up is, Will They Rent Your Property for Top Dollar Fast? So that's what we have to look forward to next. Anything else?
Can't wait.
Nothing else for me.
All right, Lacey, always a pleasure.
Absolutely. We'll see you next time.
All right, ladies, thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
And there we have it. Thanks for listening in. If you want to continue the conversation, go to www.landlordprofitabilityplaybookpodcast.com. That's the Landlord Profitability Playbook Podcast.com, where we have additional information about the podcast and archived episodes. We'll be back next time with another episode of the Landlord Profitability Playbook Podcast.